Hello and welcome to the CAPE podcast. CAPE standing for the Child Abuse Prevention and Education Podcast. My name is Christy McVie and I am an ex-West Australian police officer who spent 10 years with the police where I was trained as a specialist child interviewer and a child abuse detective. This podcast is all about sharing what I learnt, saw and knew whilst investigating child sexual abuse in the police force. It is also about sharing the knowledge that I gained in that time that helped me with my own parenting of my then 2-year-old daughter. My mission is to help share my knowledge and to help you in your role as parents to keep your kids safe, along with guest experts in the field of child abuse prevention and education, both in person and online. Thank you so much for joining in on the fight to prevent child sexual abuse. Your kids will thank you for it. I wish to offer a content warning for this podcast. Some of this interview involves discussions around child sexual abuse and abuse, which may be distressing to some listeners. If you find anything triggering or upsetting about this podcast, please check out the show notes for links and resources, but always remember to look after your own mental health first. But otherwise, I hope you enjoy the interview. Thank you. I am here with Genevieve Jones, one of my friends who I met mutually through our mutual work through WA Child Safety Service. Genevieve is a social scientist, and I won't try and explain what that is because I'm learning something new today, but she has a degree or bachelor's degree in social science, which we just joked about that she's the Brene Brown of Western Australia, but she uses her social science degree to work with children and people in relationship to that. So thank you for joining me, Jen. I really appreciate you for having a chat with me today. You've got a very interesting story. But first of all, tell me about how you got into social science.
Okay, so I started off doing social work actually. Oh, no, that was the second attempt at uni. The first attempt, I think, was health promotion.
Yep.
Anyway, I got to the social work degree. It was very dry. It didn't seem like it was the degree I wanted to get. And then I heard social science was a little better in a way you could choose your majors and minors a lot. So I focused in, there was lots of units on child sex abuse or child abuse in general. There was units on psychology, sociology. So it seemed a lot, just a lot more inviting than the social work degree. So it kind of has a lot of social work units in it, but it's also padded out with, specific units on abuse in children and child development, which is where I was always wanting to head, was working with children. So it seemed a lot more kind of fitting.
Yeah, and what led you to that wanting to work with children and learning more about the psychology and stuff like that?
Yeah, it was definitely from my childhood, and I've always had a very inquisitive mind, I guess, and been interested in social relationships and what makes people tick, and from quite a young age. And from the trauma I suffered, I felt almost it was an attempt to understand how I responded and how people in general respond to trauma, how I survived, and how we can promote healing, I guess, as well when someone's been traumatized. So through my personal interest and also that desire to try to help other people or prevent other people more so from having to experience the nightmare that I lived as a child.
Yeah, so you've mentioned trauma as a child, and I know that you have lived experience in child sexual abuse and child abuse. Are you comfortable? If you're comfortable, do you want to just explain a little bit about what that feels like for you as an adult now? You said you had 25 years of therapy, and you've done a lot of healing and a lot of development, which is what I expect but what I see people in your situation, people who've gone on to help others, because you want, I know from my own personal experience with, mental and emotional and psychological abuse, I'm driven to help others. And it sounds like you're a bit the same. You were driven to help.
Yeah. Yes, it does seem that so many people in our field are drawn to this area, doesn't it? Most people have had their own experiences without a doubt. And I think, you have to dig, I guess, as part of the healing recovery process, and I think you perhaps wouldn't have to go there if you hadn't had it. So I think that kind of pushes people in that direction to help others once they've got a little bit on their way to recovery. So I experienced, I suppose for now, when you said how does it impact my life now or something like that, I've got complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which is really, really hard to function with. And I think we spoke the other day about the one big component can be the issues with trying to sleep, and that's just really, really one of the ongoing issues that I struggle with. So that complex PTSD, obviously, it's the difference between the PTSD and the complex PTSD is it's an ongoing exposure to trauma and multiple events. So that was very much what I endured from, it was probably from in utero. I'd say I would have started suffering the adverse consequences of my mother's health, the high cortisol and things like that.
Yeah.
But then, and it was just chaos from the moment I was born, my life. But it got really, really particularly traumatic and horrific when she left my father for a sex offender. And I can quite confidently say he was a psychopath.
Yeah.
So my mum, it's important, I suppose, to understand the vulnerability of my mother. So she was a single mum with 4 children, had quite chronic mental health issues herself, had been sexually abused as a child, so it's that intergenerational transmission, and didn't have the capacity to keep her 4 children safe. So I believed that the sex offender who offended against me and my siblings, he was a true psychopath, and he also was a sex offender, so groomed the whole family, the whole community, and then groomed me and my siblings to be sexually abused. So I lived 3 to 8, and that was when probably, it was pretty horrific until I was early 20s, actually, in my life, to be honest, under the kind of, as my mother being who she was and quite very, very unstable. I think she got diagnosed a few times and a few different diagnoses, as you do, but basically trauma-related, like, bipolar disorder, personality disorder. So she had all those kind of labels. But yeah, she was a very vulnerable target, and this psychopath just spent years and years not only with the sexual abuse but the physical abuse. So the domestic violence between him and my mother was I would say equally, if not more, as damaging as what the sexual abuse was. Not that we can kind of compare suffering and abuse, but that was just as horrific. So that was definitely from the moment that he started with all the abuse, I would have had PTSD. Because his behaviours were really quite
extreme,
sick. Very extreme. Yes, very extreme. Psychopathic, I guess you'd say.
It's something that you see, I saw as a detective and working in child abuse, in the child abuse squad. I saw very similar stories to yours where, and it seems to be that, parents who have been abused or are in domestic violence, especially domestic violence, they have this huge vulnerability that they're so much more vulnerable to those people. They're searching for families like that who are vulnerable because and your mum was vulnerable. Your mum was vulnerable. So
yes, she was so vulnerable, and like you say, they just magnetize to vulnerable families. And he had access to 4 children, and mum would go and work at night time, so we were just extremely vulnerable, and that's just makes the crime so horrific to know that you're already struggling with the vulnerabilities, and then you get that on top of it. But
I know.
And also the trauma that my mum had, and she never dealt with any of it and became an alcoholic. And then wasn't able to identify abuse. She was being beaten up by him. And she was just, not able to protect us.
Yeah. And we still see that today. Like, you know, we're in our 40s and whatnot. And, you know, that was quite common that was much more common. You know, you saw it.
Yeah, early 80s.
Yeah, early 80s. But now we're still seeing that. It's just, we're talking about it more, I guess. But back when your mum was dealing with all of this stuff, it would have been hidden away. You wouldn't go and seek help or talk to someone, or
No
you know what I mean? No one would be reporting what they were seeing to anyone else.
Very hidden.
Yeah.
Yeah, and also lived in a house in a really, high socio-economic area, Netherlands. You know, white picket fence. He had a lot of money, drove a yellow Volvo, was a businessman. So even I think it was even extra hidden because it was a very affluent area and people just didn't think it kind of happened in those areas. But as we know, no one's immune. Yeah, so it was we very much fell through the gaps.
Yeah, I bet. Wow. So what do you think? So post all of what happened and leaving home and stuff like that, where did you go from there? Like, did you go straight to uni? Were you working? Like, what happened with you once you were out of that environment?
So I managed to make it to the end of year 12 with not very good grades and not very good attendance because of the level of chaos in my house. Mum had left him when I was 8, but then she went on to have a string of abusive relationships, not sexually abusive to me, but very, very physically violent. So I never had an environment that was conducive to study whatsoever. In fact, Mum had moved out when I was about 14, and my older brother, who got into drugs very early, was the one that was meant to be my, responsible role model. So I essentially lived in a party drug house.
Oh my God.
From about 14 to 17. So no parents ever. And just, birds of a feather, I guess, or the people who were a little bit lost and getting into drugs using from trauma. Most of the time, when I look back in hindsight, the house was just a permanent party house. So I ended up going to uni quite a bit later. I went into the health and fitness industry because exercise is what kind of helped me deal with the cortisol and the stress. Not that I knew it at the time. So then that I gravitated towards that area. And it wasn't till a little bit later that I, got into the social science and started wanting to work in this area, in the child abuse area.
Yeah, right.
So it was definitely not a linear process, but that's kind of how it happened.
How do you think having the experiences that you did and knowing what you've gone through has helped you in your social science and your degree and your work with children and other victims?
I guess having that lived experience of just how horrific and how pervasive trauma is. Understand. So it happened when I was 3. My first memories are kind of about 4-ish. To know how the body adapts to trauma. Yeah. So I suppose I had all those PTSD symptoms. Like I had the hypervigilance, I had the frozenness. I would just basically oscillate between flight, fight, and freeze my whole childhood. So I can really identify children when you've experienced it yourself. It's very easy to identify and have an understanding of actually how they're basically, many of them are living on survival mode.
Yes.
So I suppose that insight with the impact of trauma, I kind of believe unless you really experience some form of trauma, it's very hard to even imagine just how hard it is to manage and just how your life is so different from someone that doesn't have trauma.
Yeah, that's a good question about trauma, right? Because we'll get back to, the difference. So when you see a child, what kind of signs does a child in trauma or living in that fight, flight, freeze, what kind of signs do you remember from your own childhood and when you see children in your job?
Yep. So I guess my most prevalent one would be the freeze response. Yeah. And I know with that freeze response, my stress levels, my cortisol levels and adrenaline were always so high and they never switched off. So I was constantly scanning the environment. I was constantly hypervigilant. I was a people pleaser because I thought if I didn't make someone angry, then they won't hurt me and I won't be abused and I won't be abandoned.
Yeah.
So I've had to work really hard on that because that was my survival skill. If I got someone angry, and particularly my mother's de facto, that was when he was angry and he made up a reason as to why why he was abusing me, but I ended up internalizing it like most children do.
Yes.
Like it was all my fault. It was so much guilt, so much shame. He said, so his grooming was, I was dirty for wearing knickers to bed. And I was only like nearly 4 when it first started. I was dirty for wearing knickers to bed. So he would have to punish me, and that would be sexual abuse in the shower. And I just 100% believed until I was about 16 that I deserved that punishment because I was dirty. So that guilt and that shame, and I think shame is something that, you know, is so damaging for your sense of self. So it's very fragmented. And yeah, so I just oscillated between that freeze response, the people. From a very young age, I was always waiting for the next crisis, pretty much, if not daily, then weekly. So my whole nervous system just adapted to this ongoing, you know, preparing yourself for the next crisis really just completely exhausts and damages your nervous system.
Does that show as
well as your brain? So, you know, that little amygdala.
Yeah.
Sorry?
Does that show as anxiety or like anxiety-like symptoms?
Definitely.
You know?
Yeah, I'd definitely say anxiety and that inability to actually just feel safe. And I think, you know, from protective behaviours, we all have the right to feel safe and be safe at all times. And I just didn't know what it was to feel safe. And that's something I take forward. We can't assume that children even know what it is to feel safe, because I wouldn't have been able to explain. It's only in the last probably 5 years that I can actually have a real fleeting glimpse of feeling safe in my body. So I think all the dissociation, that definitely impacts your capacity to function. And I think dissociation is like that mental flight. So I physically couldn't get out of that bathroom or away from him. So mentally I would escape.
Yeah.
So I think living with that disassociation is really impairs your capacity to do a lot of things.
So is that like people who might be a little bit not making up, but like they're not off in the dream world kind of thing, often daydreaming?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah?
Yes, exactly. They've taken themselves to another place, and I can spot them in class. And sometimes it might just be that developmental, you know, daydreaming, but I can spot it. I know lots of kids that are traumatized, and you can see them, and, you know, teachers would often say, oh, you know, they're real daydreamers, and it's like, no, it's trauma. So I think it gives you that trauma lens. But very hard to focus because you just don't want to be in the moment, because that's scary to be in the moment. So it's like almost symptoms similar to ADHD in a way as well, I guess. Very, very disrupted. So most photos you see when I was in primary school, I've got massive black bags under my eyes. And then in high school, I lived in the party house, so we were out drinking till late, and I wasn't sleeping because, you know, we were drinking and doing stuff like that. But then when I actually stopped, and all the PTSD symptoms just came and hit me in the face in a massive way, and I was virtually housebound. And that's when the real severe kind of insomnia kicked in. I was having flashbacks and nightmares and too scared to sleep, and my body just couldn't relax enough to get into that sleep state. So it's hard to kind of gauge how I was as a kid, because before, after trauma, I don't know, but
Another symptom I think of trauma that I hear of from victims is there's gaps in their memory.
Yes, and that makes it so confusing and so hard. Like, I remember the first time I went to the police station to give a statement, and this was when I just accessed therapy, and I'd realised, oh my effing God, like, I cannot believe this has all happened, but it all just came flooding back. But it comes in snapshots, so it's not like it's not like a sequential story from the beginning to the end, which makes it so hard to kind of report, because that's not how, when you're that age, that's not how your brain stores it at all. So mine's snapshots, and very hard to have like if they say what time it was, I wouldn't know. So certain things that I was asked, I just had no idea, because my memories were stored as kind of like flashes.
Yep.
Yeah, so very hard to do. Some things I remember, not so much the sexual abuse. I remember a lot of he did a lot of torturing stuff, so I remember a lot of things he used to do to me. I remember them quite clearly. And the domestic violence, I remember just, being frozen in fear, thinking my mum was going to die. But yeah, the memory is definitely not clear or sequential at all. Yeah, it's very fragmented.
Yeah. And that's
your body.
That's
I think
trauma.
it's your body.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. And I think, the good old Bessel van der Kolk, the body keeps a score.
Yeah.
You read that one?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing, that one. And that was just so true for me. Like, I was just like a bundle of tense muscles. So even though I didn't have a lot of the memories and understanding why I was like that, my body just, it definitely, the issues are in your tissues, they say. And I think that body just really remembers everything that goes on. Yeah.
So what was a turning point for you? What was I had someone say to me recently that you don't ever heal from that kind of trauma. You don't ever, and we like to say trauma, healing, I'm on a healing journey. And we say all these catchwords, but and some people seem to heal or like appear to be healing more than others, right?
Yes.
And some people are so caught up in their emotions and what happened to them that they don't seem to be functioning.
Yes.
And so what was a turning point for you? Like do you feel like you have recovered, healed, all of those things? I know that you've done a lot of work and all of that. Yeah. What do you reckon?
So I would say healing and recovery are a lifelong process.
Yeah.
And, there's often, in the media, you can often get conceptions of people go from surviving to thriving. And I definitely wouldn't say I'm thriving.
Who is, though?
I wouldn't say I was thriving. Yeah, exactly. But so sometimes I survive a lot better than other times. And I'm very sensitive to stress. So as soon as a few things, children, exes, all that kind of stuff, ex-husbands and stressors in my life, as soon as the stresses get big, I know that the symptoms get really, really high. And my window of tolerance, the window of tolerance.
Yeah.
And if you've had trauma, it ends up sometimes being like that. So it doesn't
like really small.
much. Yes. So it doesn't take much for me to kind of be feeling really overwhelmed. And then when you're in those high stress places, you can kind of resort to your kind of old coping mechanisms, which aren't that helpful. So I would say when I was 23, that was the age where I just got bombarded with all the stuff that I think I'd held in tight. So I started having panic attacks, and I don't know if you've ever had them, Christy, but they are so scary, so terrifying. I thought I was going mad. I thought I was never going to get out of this trance of being in a panic attack. Sometimes it felt like I was in one the whole day. Like sometimes I just couldn't shift out of that panic. So I don't have them anymore, and that's a huge win, and that's from therapy. And so 23, I was bombarded with all the PTS symptoms in a massive way, and I was housebound, and that forced me, because I had no other choice. It was just so scary, thinking my fear was so massive that I was just incubated in terror, and I just couldn't even go out. So I accessed therapy, and that I say is the single most important thing. If you can find a skilled therapist who's full bottle on trauma and very, very trauma informed, that's been my one constant and what definitely has contributed to where I am now, I'd say. And I never really had much of a safe person in my life, and so it's almost now I've got that one consistent safe person, so that just is really healing for my nervous system. And I suppose it's the validation. And I think with trauma, Christy, I realise more and more it's about, I think most of the trauma comes from being alone in your trauma.
Oh, yeah.
And I was so alone all the time. So, I was told not to talk and all that kind of stuff. So I carried that trauma, and I was just so alone with it. And I think that's where a big part of the trauma comes from. So now having some, safe relationships and connection, that's definitely
makes a difference.
Been really, really nourishing. Yeah, massive difference, and very nourishing for my nervous system. I find it hard to ask for help, but it's these skills, I guess, that as you get on the recovery program, you learn. I suppose I adapted in so many survival mechanisms. So it's kind of trying to lose all those ways that I had to adapt.
Yep.
And then they come maladaptive, don't they? And it's like, well, that worked and it's great. I survived it. But then they became maladaptive. So then it's having to kind of reinvent, you. So yes, I don't know. I don't know how far I am in it, but I have more good days than bad days.
That's a blessing.
And I'm and I suppose just being so trauma informed and so educated in trauma and how it impacts the body and what helps and what doesn't. That I feel like I am kind of getting better as time goes on. Yeah.
Do you think having the knowledge that you do around trauma actually helps in recovering from trauma?
Or having the knowledge helps?
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely, because for so long, all the symptoms were confusing and I couldn't, there was no names for them, and it was just this awful kind of numb feeling or disassociated feeling. And before I learned kind of, oh, wow, that's how my body adapted. And that was, that was so brilliant and so clever that it did that, rather than being ashamed of the fact that, I'd start having these feelings and feel overwhelmed.
Yep.
Having understanding that's actually a normal response to an abnormal situation. So it's quite de-shaming and quite empowering to know that this is what happens with trauma. Like, this is a symptom of trauma.
Yeah.
So it helps a lot with the shame, I think, of feeling like you're a bit of a fruitcake, knowing that it couldn't have been any other way.
Well, you've said some really powerful things in like just then. You said that trauma, when you're alone in your trauma and you can't talk to anyone, and finding that safe person that you can talk to that's not going to make you feel worse. And like I haven't had it put to me that way. Like, the worst thing is that you're alone with your trauma, and it's the worst thing that can happen to you because you're in it. It's just you in it, on like sinking basically. And the second thing is that I really love that you pointed out is that knowing how your body reacts and why it's reacting, and being able to understand those reactions and realize that they're, like you said, it's a normal reaction for an abnormal experience, basically. Like, that's really powerful stuff to, Yeah,
and I think, when you get the understanding of the nervous system, the autonomic nervous system, and how with trauma, you're stuck in the sympathetic nervous system, so you're constantly on that fight. So how we can actually control, with effort, obviously, and time and practice, to get out of that sympathetic into the parasympathetic, and there's so many ways we can do it, and they're effective. So it gives you hope, because it's like, I don't have to be stuck feeling like that all the time. These are the skills that if I do them, then I'll take myself out of that, that really uncomfortable flight, fight, freeze survival mode. Which is exhausting. And I think I did develop chronic fatigue for a few years, and just all that adrenaline and running on that adrenaline ends up just depleting you. And so it's exhausting living like that.
It makes a lot of sense, because obviously with my own situation, getting PTSD from the policing and it started off as hypervigilance and anxiety, and then become PTSD. And how you're talking about that window of, what was the word? Tolerance. And I know myself that it's like little. And I used to have all the patience in the world.
I know. Yes.
And now I've got very little.
Yeah, it really does shrink it, doesn't it? It really does shrink it. And I try to explain to people, like, you don't understand, like, it doesn't take much before I'm just overwhelmed and I'm just a few things and I'm done. Like, it was like, I've got less than half battery life kind of thing. So really, I think that's the part that really is it. I mean, I suffer mainly from the PTSD, which is more anxiety than depression. But then when you feel restricted, because you're like, I know I've got the skills, I've got the capacity, but it is compromised by the trauma.
Yeah.
So that can really, that gets frustrating, but you deal with it how you best can, I guess.
I think a bit of compassion towards the fact that you have gone through all of that and you've survived, and you're creating, you're helping others. I know that being the people pleaser we are, we don't want to, we want to be more all the time. We want to be more, do more, but we can't.
Never good enough
anymore. Yes.
And I think sometimes realizing your capacity, and it's not an option anymore. Like, you can't be the perfectionist. You can't. you can't pour from an empty cup kind of thing.
Yeah.
So it's like, that kind of, I suppose, in a way forces you to do that self-care, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Which I would never knew what self-care was. So that's, it really forced me to go, if I don't start, looking after myself, then one, I can't look after my kids, but two, you're no good to anyone. So it does force the self-care.
Oh yeah, and then you'll fall in a heap again if you don't. Like, you'll just be useless to everyone. So yeah. So one question I ask everyone is that, and I've got this saying that if people knew what I knew, or parents knew what I knew, they would do things differently. So what's one thing you can think of that if parents knew what you knew, they would do things differently?
I think it is to have there's a lot of things, but what comes to the top of my mind first is, I know so many times in so many situations, and even when I've worked with families as a, protective behaviours educator and a safety advocate, they've just been in total bewilderment and shock and disbelief that something like this could happen in their family. And, it's still a bit of a belief that it kind of happens out there and not in our place and not in our suburb. And just for I suppose, parents to understand how prevalent it is, because I still think maybe it's a certain level of denial that, that kind of stuff wouldn't happen in our family or to anyone I know, kind of thing. But just, how prevalent it is. We say, what do we say? 1 in 3 girls, 1 in 6 to 7 boys. Yep. And that's the ones that are just reported, and we know it's the most underreported crime. And also, I suppose that what I say in parent workshops is just making sure you always believe the child. And I did tell my mum at, was it 16 years? About 16, actually, when it all started coming up. I think it was quite repressed. And she didn't believe me. And that was trauma on trauma.
Yep.
And I'm still hearing so many stories of kids, who are telling parents, and they're dismissing it, saying they're lying, couldn't have happened, maybe they're just exaggerating. So I just think, just that one simple thing, always believe the child, because that would have changed my trajectory a lot, to have that validation and that belief from the very person who was caring for me to then take his side and belittle me and shame me. And so that was a bit of a turning point where I went off a very, very slippery slope with risk-taking and stuff like that. So believing the child, knowing that it's actually something that is very common in society.
Yes.
And having the open, honest conversations, like not thinking that, it's something that children can't handle listening to, as long as it's age appropriate, but just to make those ongoing conversations part of your child's life. Because, so
I'm imagining as a parent, and after everything, and talking about age appropriate conversations, and we'll talk about this and then finish up, but I'm imagining that after the experiences you've had and the knowledge that you have, as age appropriate conversations, it would have been like talked about in your family. You wouldn't have hidden away from this subject. And I didn't hide away from it either. Like, my 3-year-old, I was talking about body autonomy and what, all of these things, protective behaviours things. So am I right?
Yeah, totally. Like, it definitely becomes almost the most important part of parenting.
Yes.
So like you, Christy, I had all the books, I had all the conversations, all the clips. I'd be like, oh, Mum, not another one of these books again. Like, it was so important, and just knowing that, obviously, if you educate your children in the body safety and secrets and stuff like that, they are less of a target for sex offenders, and you're decreasing their risk, not increasing their risks of, I had a mum once say to me, I don't want my child doing what you're teaching. She'll lose her innocence. And I'm like, no, what loses their innocence is when they're being abused and they don't know what to do.
Yes.
Like, so it's just, they deserve that empowerment. It's their right to have that education to keep themselves safe. So, of course, it's I think the most powerful tool we have is education when it comes to reducing sex.
Yeah, I 100% agree. It's like my big thing is, and it's why I wrote a book about it. I didn't write it about protective behaviours, but I wrote it about my experiences so that parents knew what I knew. Yes. But I am 1000% protective behaviours education can prevent child abuse, along with being a protective parent, along with being...
Absolutely, it does. We can prevent it. Yeah, definitely.
Well, thank you so much. So just to finish off, so you've gone through all of that and you're teaching protective behaviours and what else are you doing in your life?
So I'm just actually really focusing on my girls at the moment because they're both needing a bit of extra
love and attention.
Yeah, they certainly are. And I wouldn't want to put my attention anywhere else. Financially, it's not that great, but I'm happy that I'm in a position where I can actually do that. So, so it's really kind of being there for my children. And I guess I didn't have parents that were there for me, and my mum was very absent. So it feels like a privilege that I can actually be there, you know, for my children a lot. And then, and then I do the protective behaviours. So I, working one-to-one, teaching the protective behaviours program, doing a few workshops on grooming and for teenagers and things like that. But so workshops and one-to-one kind of sessions I'm mainly doing at the moment.
I think and I can talk from experience, when you haven't had that supportive parenting role model, that's all you want to be for your kids.
Totally.
I don't know. All I can think of is, and I'm in a similar situation. I mean, I'm working for myself, but I'm in a similar situation. I didn't have, I was kicked out of home at 15. My daughter's 15, like all of that sort of stuff. Like, I'm like, I just want to be there for her so she doesn't feel how alone and
what you felt.
Maybe a little bit smothering, but I'm just, at the same time, I'm like, I just need to be there. So I can totally relate to that.
I'm the same, especially in those risk-taking years where I think, like I said before, if you don't have that connection, they don't care what you say. If you don't have the connection, they don't care what you say. So, so I read a lot of the, how to, nurture that attachment with the children. I think that is probably the single most important thing as well. Else they don't care what you say. So I think it's time spent, and exhausting.
It's exhausting, I wonder, I talk to parents of like adults, like they've got adult children, they're like, you never stop worrying about them. I'm like, I'm like, oh my God, my whole, and because we have that anxious, nervous system, like I'm forever going to be anxious and nervous about my child.
I know, and they haven't even got their license yet, so I'm not looking forward to that.
Thank you so much, Jen. I really appreciate you being so candid and sharing your story, and it's very inspiring, and it's also helpful, I think, people realizing that they're not alone by hearing stories like yours. Oh, thanks, Christy. It was a pleasure to be on your podcast, and there was no yawning and no yelling at your husband, so it was a win. I think I have to explain this now. Thank you very much, Jen. So thanks, Jen, for dubbing me in. I've got a group chat, a Facebook group, and I do a Facebook Live now and again, and Jen's laughing about the fact that my husband walked in on my Facebook Live, and I assertively told him off whilst on the Facebook Live. And she thinks
very good value. It's great though how you can make a serious topic and actually make most people, do quite a few belly laughs in your online chats, Christy. I think they've become part of my therapy, actually, the laughing therapy, and I learn from it as well.
Oh, awesome! All right. Well, thank you for listening to this podcast episode. Education empowers children and it empowers parents, and education prevents abuse. That is why I'm here, and that is why you are here. So thank you. If you want any further information or support, follow me on social media, either under Christy McVie or Cape AU social media accounts. I'll put the links in the show notes. You can also purchase a signed copy of my book, Operation Kids Safe, via the website at www.cape-au.com. Also on my website is a free ebook titled 10 Tips to Keep Your Kids Safe from Abuse, and self-paced courses for parents to help you in your journey of child abuse prevention. Don't forget to join our free Facebook group called Operation Kids Safe Parenting Group. Please see the show notes for any extra information, links and help should you be looking for extra support. Thank you once again for giving a shit about preventing child sexual abuse. See you next time.